Is it? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, just. Yeah. Good. Oh, my. Oh, my. Oh, yeah. Good. Ah. Hello. Oh, yeah.
Shriye Namo Shriye Namo Tamah Shriye Soha Om Namo Shriye Namo Shriye Namo Tamah Shriye Soha Om Namo Shriye Namo Shriye Namo Tamah Shriye Soha.
Good morning again, Rinpoche. Tashidale. We are rejoicing in your good health, and we're delighted that you're willing to resume these teachings on the Rice Seedling Sutra. Thank you for teaching us. And good morning, Katrina.
Shukadele genla. Ani yiri manjaya yangar jaya gabo chungso. Ani di sungchu di naya mutu naya tukche na shuyeres.
And good morning, Katrina. We're happy to have such a skilled translator translating these teachings for us.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. Oh, to say, yeah.
Just to let you know, Venerable Truden is on a teaching tour in Asia, and she'll be back on January 6th, and she sends her kind regards.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, did. Oh, yeah. Oh, dear.
So as usual, we'll begin with some prayers, and you'll find a link to those prayers in the chat box. To the teacher endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one thus gone, the foe destroyer, completely and fully awakened one, perfect in knowledge and good conduct, one gone to this, nor the world's supreme guide of beings to be tamed. Teacher of gods and humans, to you, the Buddha endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. When, O supreme among humans, you are born on this earth, you paced 7 strides and said, I am supreme in this world. To you who are wise, then I bow. With pure bodies formed supremely fine, wisdom ocean like a golden mountain. Fame that blazes in the 3 worlds, winner the best, supreme guide, to you I bow. With the supreme signs, face like a spotless moon, color like gold, to you I bow. You are immaculate, the 3 worlds are not incomparable, wise one, to you I bow. Great compassionate protector, all-knowing teacher, field of merit and good qualities, vast as an ocean, to the Tathagata I bow. Through purity, freeing from attachment, virtue freeing from the lower realms, unique, supreme, ultimate, not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind completely, this is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a mirage, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop, a dew, a bubble. A dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud, see conditioned things as such. Through this merit may sentient beings attain the state of all seeing, subdue the foe of false, and be delivered from the ocean of cyclic existence, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. This ground anointed with perfume, flowers strewn Mount Meru, foreland, sun and moon, imagined as the Buddha land and offered to you, may all beings enjoy this pure land. Venerable holy gurus, in the space of your truth body, from billowing clouds of your wisdom and love, let fall the rain of the profound and extensive Dharma, in whatever form is suitable for such.
다 직송게나.
그래서
직송.
진짜 가서 조지 반대 어디샤게 람드레일레 로아 누가서 강시 탐네 강다게 고야 대화 점달라 라니 돈도 녀시바 기부테네 타마르시에서 저 당부 주에 고츠에디 속여라 말아도 저 당부 고츠에디 간에 속으래서나 네 기부 탐함 기부 당부돼서라 내 당부 받게 어때네 야야 견로 기분 중인데 처음부터 좋은 거라 어디에 가서 강시 탐네 간다 그랬어 코에 대화 점달아서 코에 대화들 하다 미 여와들에 대화라 여와 치마들 하다 미 겨와 상부지 톱 나왔음 아이 겨와 상부지 톱 나왔음 그래서는 냐와 예다 던르주줄 깨는 동해 마무도 삼 당간 중 웃음 통대 던르주주 통대기도 와 던르를 지켜봐이나 내시 때문에 동해 지글러 지 사회 동해 현지 구주시 사회 동해 배주시 어세 던르 용도 와 이만주 통도로 와 당간주 당동고 스마동게 냐와서 사회 동해 세진용 된게 사회 동해 세진용 된게 지글레치 전에 세르치 된게라 진짜는 냐외 동해 요라 이 찬다도 가서 미롱발에 요라 요 치마인데 이기 말을 삼고 말한 가지고 천딜이야 잠불린 통고도 지게치 세르 메톤다 추담 bom다 세르 도도 근데 매치 봐 연구도 결시태바 연구도 도시태는 사회면에 무비 존이 시야 연구도 냐와이다 던르 동에 찬다와데 미롱발에 예송어라 텔레 때는 샹다 텔레 도어든데 여버데 포토라 수수잖아 어디인데 겨와치마 던르 잡질게나 동에 던르도 삼사티 삼고여라 네 텔레 도가 냐와데 비케베네 산예 식배 동에로 장외 동에 네 이달께는 사야면에 사야 세간도네 나라줄로 무비데 중선에 칼라면에 배세간도네 깔려요라 도시텐게 마보요라 진짜 직전에 깔려요래 삼 와 여와이다 진짜를 매기 와서 제고 삼 당부 대삼을 고고요라 텔레께는 강겐도 삼사 삼르시다 와 던르 조종 무슨 통내도 냐와요래 지저세 가시 어디 다가스다 신학구거를 삼기어라데 신학구르도 말아 근데 요래 다스거라 이게 마치데 소소게네 예게 소소레사나 텔리키르 깨레마사나 텔리키 마레스시거라 어디인데 가서라 가시 탐네 간다게세 냐와에다 전도를 마치베시 요와 냠바실을 마치베시 요와 상불하다 미 대화시 톱나왔음 하다 미니부터 레다 녀몬보 와게 할레게 밀게 되고 코아르바 코라바스 레다 녀몬베 샤와도 전에 깨와실라 양테 라메바 토르공게텔 코아바스 거라 라르 라와게 요마라 라게 교왕아만에 사샤베 레 기디고 와게네 교와상에다 디두나조 지뇨 아니 야 라와메바 시공게텔이야 코아바스 거라 전에 하다미 레다 녀모보게 하다미 리케베데 라와메바 레다 녀모보게 계시 시고요라 저선 코아바스거라 제선자 텔레메기베타 다시 탑네 간다게스 샬라 체웨 주 메게와 주티파 예수스물레 케웨 주카레스네 샬라 체웨 준동게 아니 룡아 예수 믿고네 메게와 주티 전하니 예수를 끼라 메게와 주티 빵 된도서 개와 주티 좀나 하다 메기라 탑데레 어딘데 가시 탐네 간다겠어 메게 중간 좀 남겨하고 거라 르지권에 소체바 마신발렘바 로임사라 나게 권에 깨지셔도 참아 직수사라 아니 샘기 삼을 다운데 Shanji Norda, Tindeli, Nafsimche, Tingala Chuna Asam, Nafsimche, Roa. Nafsimche, Shalia, never care, Samlo. Logda Sudu, Lakum de Kawanga, Lakawachana, Namin Jebu Baobana, Kawanoya Ayu, Lamikiwachana, Tinamin Jebu Kawashima Tunga, Eten Samla, and it you log that one. Le Kawachana, Jebu Tawa Yoyati, Gansu Sendila Hakudwa. Le Tugachana, Tunga Yoyati, Sendila Pecha Hakoya Yora. Tonjun Jubi Le Sector. Sendila Tugachana. Jovanga Bacha Tubuchan, Tunga Yoyati, you do a Gansu Totoa. Oti the Kole Kawachana, Jebu Samboya, Le Mikiwachana, Jebu Nabayoya. Le said, so send the summer tonjo, send bell lesera. Some immediately to judge Chego, some Sembanet, Sembele Saura. Sembasera. At the neck, I con a Geshe on a court to judge Geshe, Nagile Saura. Keletane Lugi Cholam, there's a contract, should not give me that attention. Luigi less Saura. O Tiletana, and the Pachotel never got. What in the take as a Kashi Tamne Kandakis. Miki was to the park, to be tablet and Esora. Quite a watsam della. Nesusum Magi Vechel had a meat, give us some bush of Tabasora. Rangi Tanto Nechabo, give us some bush of Torachena, some social tenichinga. Deva Janketis, Chungo Sigora, Tambo got to set nets of Gora. Quite a watsam della Rangi Tanto Nechaba, Kibutene, Tamar Shes, Tambo Tambuteta. What is you know among us?
So here, to begin with, from Atisha's Lamp for the Path, there's a verse which says, "Know that those who, by whatever means, seek for themselves no more than the pleasures of cyclic existence are the persons of least capacity." So here, as a beginner, we have to start with this first level of Dharma. We need to begin with this kind of thought of gaining a good rebirth. And then from there, we are able to pursue the trainings for the beings of middling and great capacity. But here, when we look at a birth as a human or a god, we're looking at something that is a much better kind of birth than when we look at the rebirths as, say, a hell being, a hungry ghost, an animal. Those are seen as being really objectively very much suffering. So here we see, like, for example, we can directly see animals. We see how sort of stupid and deluded they are, how much abused they are by humans. We force them into various activities. We use them for meat. We use them for their skins and so forth. So that's something that we can directly see. We're able to actually witness that. And even though there are realms like, say, for example, the hungry ghosts and the hell realms that we can't see, look around at the human world. And even in this human world, there are those that are dying by the hundreds, the thousands, that we can see in this world, those that die from heat exposure, those that die from cold. There are those that die from lack of food. They die through famine. So if we imagine, what would it be like to be born in such a situation? Again, we can see something like an animal rebirth, but something like the hell realms, we can see a sort of taste of that in the human world through the kinds of sufferings of hot and cold. Or so too, like the realm of the hungry ghosts, the difficulty of finding food. I mean, we can see humans who die from starvation, from not having enough. So we need to first begin by seeing this and looking at the fact that if we accumulate the kind of negative actions, we are going to take such a rebirth in those lower realms, experiencing those types of suffering. So to not be born in a bad rebirth, we need to create the proper kinds of causes. So a human or a god rebirth comes from accumulating the proper kind of karma. It is still within samsara. What it means to be within samsara is that we are taking a rebirth under the control of karma and the afflictions. There is no autonomy. There is no freedom there. Even as a human or a god, we have to die and continue to face the karma that we have accumulated. So this kind of samsaric a process whereby we're uncontrollably taking rebirth due to karma and the afflictions, the first sort of method that we need to employ is to make sure that we're not born in one of those realms where we are so overwhelmed by suffering that we can't do anything about it. So the negative kinds of actions, the very base that we need to begin with, is abandoning the negative actions, those negativities of body, speech, and mind that lead to such a negative rebirth, and in turn do the opposite, engage in activities like the 10 virtuous activities. So when we do things like with our body, harm others, kill them, engage in sexual misconduct, take things that aren't given, or we engage in negative actions with our speech, lying and harsh speech and divisive speech and idle gossip and so forth. And when we have these kinds of states of mind, like for example, covetousness, we want the things that others have, or maliciousness, where we want to inflict harm on another, or these kinds of wrong views where we think that, oh, there is no karma, cause and effect, and thereby disregard karma. These are the kinds of negative actions that are going to lead to a bad rebirth in the future. So if we don't believe in karma, we think, well, it doesn't matter what I do now. It's not as though I can expect a kind of result. If we deny that, that's going to lead us to not act in accordance with karma. And we can see, even within one life, there are cases where we are able to see that a good cause leads to a good result. These are kind of visible, apparent karmas that we can see directly. We can understand that from our own experience. And so karma, when we talk about karma, it's really our state of mind. When we have that thought of wanting to harm someone else or wanting to take someone else's things, that itself is a karma, is an action that is creating a kind of imprint for the future. And so too, when that then drives our speech to say, are saying something nasty, or we then use that kind of thought of maliciousness to engage in harmful, violent behaviors with our body, then this is going to lead to those ripening results of those actions. So at the very beginning, we need to abandon the 10 non-virtues and in turn engage in the virtuous kind of actions with the thought that, may I get a good rebirth in the future, one in which I am able to continue to progress. And so this is where we all have to begin. We have to value this kind of fundamental practice that is the basis for everything else.
인도 가서라. 나가라도 센델리아 카네케제 시에시도와 엘리처럼 지와라. 샘비 삼을 던다시도와 디 미게 어쭈디 차네 가려운 거라서는 소소 미기 미샨달라 네바제 미기 송게게 리그레데요라. 이 손자 샹라 뉴그레스 서와파에 던달 시에요라. 던다 소소레 네데요라. 카네케지 셰단디 마티 치조나리아 에발lunga 쳬발 때네 밀레 네바케 아니 라미기 서드티 용거라. 인데코 lunga 예수 거네 샬라 처음에 네바 용거리 딩마레사 동에데 텐데 대와다 텐데 삼르시요나 네 소소 밀레 네베케지 셰그마레 미나 소소를 가치르 소소이나 미다 퇴체레 소소 대와 그 줄에도 첸딜이야 계제 셰단 삼르 땅다 류절럼 또네 미기바 마부 소도 안글숨 쪽도 안하죠 어디천에 소소 첸딜에 대야 미션다 란다 드로잉게서 대와네야 소소 대와네 전달이야 미기와 주 방고레세 교와주도 두고레세 첸딜에 밀레 팽게레 밀레 강에테그 마레 소소에 기바 미에기바 용고레세 인제부데 교와체만나미 용고레세 또 첸디 라셰 대와 네트 대시 기바신 네트도 시기도와 얘네베 인다 제마들 나미들 제부네 예선을 맞을 하다 밀리키레스 시기도와 그래서 저 추스도 제마마도 첸딜 펜도 달려탄 그베서 티치부 말아 첸딜 티탑치게 된다로 라셴 라다샤니가 되어 이기가 된다로 시기도와 열 때는 예신 기바신 네베네 마음바나 제부된 그래서 그도와 어디가 저 샘을 샤고도 야
So, right now, what we do with our speech, the kind of words that we say with our mouth, and how we act with our body, the kind of thoughts that we have in our mind, when we engage in activities with these three doors that are harmful to others, it not only creates harm for them, but it's going to have a negative impact on us as well, both in this life as well as the kind of ripening results in future lives. And so, by thinking about it in this way, it's not suitable either for ourselves or others to engage in these kind of harmful activities. Even in just this life, if we have that kind of negative actions toward others, we are going to have people that dislike us. And we're not going to be in harmony. Whereas if we act in a way that is kind, that is helpful toward others, we won't have those that dislike us. We will create harmony with those around us, and we will create happiness, sort of a way to abide in happiness right now. So, although when we talk about Dharma, the kind of goal is about future lives, but the ripening result will come in the future lives. But right now, this is also a way, a method to abide happily, to have a kind of happiness in this life. So, although the main sort of ripening results of our positive actions will come in the future, acting in this way also has a very positive impact on the present.
예린 메제나를 삼루다나 소소 소아 가려는 것도 다나니 신의 초토 그러와 어레시아 미가 주치야고 말을 개와 주토 그래서 샤샤는 게 베네시오 말하시다 예린 메제나리아 소소 깨지 셰드 가르가르 셰도 삼루단도 간데 그것도 령아 줘봐 간데 연구도 그래서 공주세네 샤를 측주 마다 뜻은 요르 다네 소아 간데 연구도 다나 어다테 소소레 시디여봐 밀레 시디여봐 지지 용한테 하고라 소아들 랩스나 어디 야구지 쟤도 삼제인데 디톨이야 잉드지 쇼제고 미 메시나랑 안게트들은 주버티 용구라 나라도 레레스 임바하고 잠기 팽마라 남베초데 쳐봐 삼바세 어디 오네 레스 지지 용에 교레도 삼르다 anything 냠스 용거라 소소 제고라서 요라 쇼셰야 데 셰베던다라 셰베도 가르쳐오라 소소 냠솔라에 던다라 에스고라 냠솔라나에 데부테 와티 오네 소르토고라 이 셰베 거바디 오네 디 메시나 소르토고라 이나네 하고 잠께 쳐요 말도 어디인데 이 낭베 추게 베 나라즈 티삼부도 어디다 레라브르 강가하고 그래서 사부게 말을 삼부도 이 시송세 디티레 샤라 차와파야 샤라 펜바투야 잠바다 차와 시송지 셰요라 너베케나 샤라 동에 연구라서 동에 전도 차와데 연구라 아니 기와초데 샤네 샤라 펜타 그래서 샤라 대와 연구라서라 대와다 트렌드도 동에데 트렌드 차와니들 시송니 셰요라 어디인데 티케 셴부치네 이 장자야 자초를 치르다네 산제 고반 받은 거야래 도르donde chöde shana chawa pambada pemba chuba nidan du songdo a chawa pambana chawa neba chujune che koe tongela soba kanga paete tongge ki ri kanga pae padu sam korto ura dewa tobe te shalia dewa lami dewa ta tarbata tamje kimbe koban ko dewa samma tomde gulo te kengura sa tenile tene shisonia kanga ya ndroya da ya je kombe ndroya mado ti chujure yushane shendaje 사바실의 신의 바드에 삼루단주면도와 데레요 마라 사 산제의 최대 저할의 시송아 인세 와 잠바다 저할의 시송그도와 잠바다 저와데 미겨 주방아세 데 저와데 셰그도와 교화주 주부레스도 잠바데 셰그도와 대와다 tren드 대와다 tren드다 동 샬라 차와방바다 대와다 tren드 년을 상만 뒤로레스 이 가처로 체르체로 단데 기분 중인데 기분 전부다 강가 랩고도 와. 티케 전부 셔비제레 삼. 이게도 마스나 까가 강할라베 테레 삼. 티야고제 셴스나니 땅마도 강가 셴로로 안가게. 간제 til아 데데케 마레사 유샤. 이 땅마데 점전에 점자게 자서 요 마라. 연애들 되러 티케 전부레사 이리 메시나를 소소 소라 소르주나. 엔테네 거네 야야르 레시오라. 이마도 가서야 야제시야 만들어야돼. 담보 장고 세대 야오지 유샤네 따셔지. 야 첨부셔지 삼을 다돼. 전부 남사 숨자고자 연구 말아. 주다 깨지 마산에 연구 말아. 어때인데 가서 일이 메시나 캐셔버려서 공부해 듣게 캐셔버려도 야.
So, in our life, day to day, we really need to come to the point where we have a feeling about this. When we engage in activities that are negative towards others, that are harmful toward others, how does that feel? How does it feel when we allow ourselves to get angry and say harsh things and so forth? And then examine the kind of feeling that we have when we reduce those, when we don't get angry with others, when we have a kind of kindness and love toward them. Then we get to a point where we're not just sort of saying these things, but we actually have a feeling about it. When we come to that level, then we will naturally avoid those kinds of harmful actions and naturally want to engage in positive actions. We talk about how important it is to first hear something and then reflect upon it, really come to an understanding, and then we need to actually implement it. We need to put it into practice in meditation. We don't explain these things just to be able to say, oh, yeah, I know that, I know that, I know that. But we do need to think about it to the point where we feel a sense of the purpose of this. Really, Buddhism is encapsulated in this kind of idea of not harming others and working to benefit them as much as you're able to. And this really begins with the kind of foundation of the being of small scope, where we say it's essential to abandon harming others. We wish that they be free from their sufferings. We wish that they have happiness. Really, these two ideas of abandoning harming others and wishing to benefit them encapsulate all of Buddhism. And it is by expanding those. We begin with the kind of recognition of the harmfulness of the 10 non-virtues and abandon that. But then this expands and expands all the way, such that our wish for others to be free from suffering comes to encompass all of the kinds of sufferings and all beings. And our wish for them to have happiness comes to expand to include all of the kinds of beings there are and the highest sorts of happiness. And so here, when we really genuinely develop these, then all of the rest of the path kind of fits into that. The Buddha Dharma is founded on love and compassion. All is really contained within those 2 points of not causing harm and wishing to benefit others. And then if we have a real felt sense of that, we can expand that and develop it more and more. And so it's very important that we hold in mind how important it is to really have a feeling about these things. Often people look at this and say, oh, this is just a kind of small practice. It's not important. I don't need to deal with that. I want to go to the big, important, higher kinds of practices. But it's not as though we can jump ahead to those things without this proper sort of foundation. We should really hold in mind that this fundamental, the being for the practice for the being of small capacity is the foundation for everything else. And it is really that which is expanded into those higher sorts of practices.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that is some Sanche. In it, this area, Joachimala, Nyawida, Tungele Tarosa, Coele to Coe Tungele Tarosha, and that Tangutile, Coe to Joalada Mi, Joati Tonda Leda Yumube Shawanti John Hada Milikia, Kishila Ram ever Tile Tarosha could do some. Roa Coe Tungele Tarosha could do Salada Milikana, Yesamji, Nimbuyo Baching, so let you day I would have to Wendy Ranchilla Mandeba Desam. Hada Mi, Lanya, you want Hada Mi, Joatia, Pangtu Chekusam, Ye Cheto Chagdang Yuma Pankusam. Roa. Ya ranchi bu koe tongele tawa tsam digmare sende pame chumbe ran tinjen changma ya tinsoye cheto shenla ya pento wachi cheto wachi gore sam ye cheto ran kyen ko se yende kundenji sanje chi juro chete ne nge shendal pento ore ye cheto ne simje tamje koe tongele tewe cheto ran langtor jene changma chinji malo ba ten tumgenge Ambo kyen kun se yende kundenji le kwa cha ko sam ane chimba chute saba samde ke wala lobate tende lobgin samsa chanju ku semje sembe kone kuno tende se sata yeche do ne chenyangi sam kuno se tam ne samba shu so tende.
So at the beginning, one thinks about if I could escape the three lower realms and take a good rebirth as a human or a god in a future life. That's what they are striving for, the freedom from those kinds of lower states of suffering. But going beyond that, a being of middling capacity recognizes that even if one is born as a human or a god, you are still under the control of karma and the afflictions. You are still within samsara. And so the thought arises, well, I need to get out of samsara altogether, even if I take such a good rebirth that is subject to the kinds of sufferings of samsara. And so rather, I need to abandon all of samsara. I need to abandon attachment and hatred in order to get rid of the kind of causes that lead to that renewed rebirth. But just to strive for my own liberation alone is really not suitable, considering all of these sentient beings who have shown me such great kindness for all of my countless rebirths. To wish to not think about them, to not care at all what happens to them is really unsuitable. And so therefore, one thinks in order to repay the kind of kindness of all of these beings, may I become a being who has eliminated all faults and developed all good qualities, such that I have the ability to fully benefit all of these sentient beings. So based upon striving for that state in which you yourself have gotten rid of all faults and developed all good qualities and have perfect knowledge of in an undeceiving way of what it is that one should adopt and abandon. If you were to be able to attain such a state, then you could really be of benefit to other sentient beings. So striving for that by practicing the six perfections, generosity and ethics, patience, joyous effort, meditative concentration, and so forth, one with this attitude of bodhicitta strives in those various practices with that as a goal. So here, setting such an attitude of bodhicitta for, please set such an attitude of bodhicitta for listening to these teachings today.
Oh yeah, 당연히 내려서 이 따들이 쇼가 진짜로 양자시 랍시잖아.
No.
간질던 배 풍부 따고 시 송바티실 풍부 따는데나 얘네 풍래션단 거과데 소담에서 도션 송체로 시도. 뒤다 기분 쟁기 코알레 단도 타로시 타블이야. 동반이 다음에 또 별로 드셔요라. 이거 중요 삼로 담이나 다음에 배 동반이 시다 검고요 말와. 처음에 다 받을 검고요 말도 지금. 집에 와도 끼와랑 그 같은데 삼도 아무도 다음에 배 동반이 검고 말아. 근데 기분 쟁이야. 기분 쟁이다 기분 천번이 내 다음에 또 거기와라. 이 다음에 배 드셔요라. 연바사제 좀 된대게. 너 날이야. 다고 냠도 따와네 녀발렘베 풍부가 본데 다 코날로 따오 생겨져래. 나가 삼사 생겨되게 풍부가를 메네네 나 삼기어레스요래. 다 가지 공장비어 풍부가데 다레세. 사제 너날로 나와 냠도 따와되게 풍부가를 나와 냠도 따기어 송도 와서요라. 뒤돈다던데 말다 하세. 간지던베 풍부 따고 쉬세. 넘버 산제 좀 되게 나오님도 따와대 풍부가라 메네 따위와래 송야 제스와라 송바테지 풍부 따되나 풍부가보다 따래 산제 텐데 송도 와세나서라 데네 풍래 샨당 고바테스 데텐데 마르다세 나 삼사텐데 풍부라 메네네 나오님도 땡겨래 송데 와 풍부라 미사데 다시데 풍부라 메네네 나 삼사텐고라 네 속으로지 통해서는 다시 연구도 와서 이 따르다 네 방아래도 와서 다시 지고라 이 풍부가야 로아실라 미네네 다고 냠도 따기 어려서 다시 송교를 마도 풍부가도 다를 송교 말아 그래서 때네 풍래 샹당 거 봤어 풍부가래 때 셴베 다시요 말아 소보다 샘다 소안 두시 다 르다 시바니 스네드라 류단 시바니레 셴베 다지 로가요 말에 류디 로가 치치 시바디 로가 치치 다생게제 로가 뭐부세부 까부숨기 수레 숨들래요 말에 성거라 풍불레 단셰베 다메스데 풍부바샤네 다지 로가 코나베 카가지 뭐부세부 나시 카가지요 말에 성거라 풍불레 뭐 타데베 다메스 띠라 어쨌든 풍레 셴다 고 바데스 이 풍부레 단샤베 다가요 마도시게 풍부가데 다이 속요 말다세 가레스나 도샤달로 수다마에 소다마에 두시다마에 두시다 number shiba ta mahin no so to as. Pumunga de da in any ta mahin bando shada ka song barwas. O tisgoda, then the pula shada go body. Suda meso dosha so chiros, or teach lapsena.
No. So here, then where we had left off in the text, and this is on page, we're actually going to be going to page 130 in the English, and just a reminder that the section from page 91 to page 102, I believe, or 104, is something that we will be going back to after this section. So here, we are going to start with this quotation from Chandrakirti's Entering the Middle Way. And again, this is discussing the idea of selflessness. For the beings of middle and great capacity, they absolutely must realize selflessness in order to get out of samsara. Now, for the being of small scope, they need to contemplate death and impermanence, although they are not yet at the point of contemplating selflessness. Now, here, this quotation from Chandrakirti's Entering the Middle Way states that, now, you may claim that the teacher said the aggregates are the self. In some sutras, we see that the Buddha, the teacher, teaches that the aggregates are the self. So you therefore assert the aggregates to be the self. But the Buddha's statement refutes a self separate from the aggregates. In other sutras, he explained that form is not the self. So here, the purpose in the Buddha's having said that the aggregates are the self is not that he's asserting that the aggregates actually are the self, but he said this in relation to the fact that we can only designate or talk about a self in relation to observing the 5 aggregates. So it is on the basis of seeing any of those 5 aggregates, or we could really distill them down to body and mind complex, that we have that thought of I. There is nowhere else in relation to which we are going to give rise to that thought of I, but rather it only occurs in relation to that particular object of observation, the 5 aggregates, or any of the 5 aggregates. Like if we see the form of Tashi, we can say, oh, Tashi is coming. Or we have this thought, oh, I'm thinking this because it's on the basis of the mind. So it is only really on the basis of the 5 aggregates, or the body and mind complex, that we can speak about an I as being something which is designated upon them. So here, this is negating the idea that there could be some sort of separate self, like we have our body over here, our mind over here, and then the self that is separate from those or distinct from those, like blue and yellow and white, like totally different and unrelated. So it is the case that in other sutras, the Buddha has taught form is not self, discrimination is not self, compositional factors are not self, and so forth. And so if it were the case that the Buddha were saying here that the aggregates actually are the self, as in like inherently are the self, that would contradict those other explanations in other sutras. However, what is being stated here is to refute that there could be some kind of self that is totally separate and apart from the aggregates.
Oh yeah. That is really so yang teni le se uma juba lo zhang yo da tan da ani ta na so bo de da ma re ba ani she ba de da ma re ani ta te le shen be da ne yong ma ra te ne ta men do a sam na se yo ra o ma re da se te ta de te ne ta ba sam na ta sha wo re se she yo ra pe na xing da Shingde kolo da ating sai shingde sene modra de de sene namdu to sene yago chuja ma yora tinal o tinal ya ne chala mangbo yora chala jani bje yire de zo re ne chene modra ge re ma de namdu re ma ra ina de zo la te ne le ga chen ge chi kang ge haro bo ru che le ga chen ge chi chu gu do e chu gu zo de zo la te ne namdu de namdu phe ge to namdu pop so sera wa modern drudo so modern te so sera namsha sha hu to ma to tina ne ronge modern de kadire se chiglu zu zu se ke me do ya la chigli ya cha la ka che ne tina dire se se che me do ti ma yin ge shan da ji wa de se te zu zu se yo ma ra na ka wa yo so te zo le te ne di modern de da se tanya ta go de te zam sha go de se Desam je yar ma to che nga razun dam ji samsu samlu na yeba na shin ti nge so bo re ti nge samlu re de nga re se lo ga ne chi be samlu ko do ngo tha de shi o ti yo ma de si yo ra Dilia, they say they yala chonelam, Shinda Ninju, Shinda Tada Sunse, Shinda Tuzu Yala Re la, Shinda Remendoase, Namdu Remendoase, Kambuta Remendoase, Yala Re. And the Tele Shambache, young Dire, Sechi, Logache, Zuzu Sayo Marwa. The Talatane, Patan and dishing that the computer and the Namdu and the Kangbaris Pataga to us. There's somebody a shah with a cigar, then I talk about some. Luta Sheba the Nile Shambache Tayo Mare. In a Tenile Tene, and a Taspa, then I talk about some Tasha Yora. There's some Tasha with this. There's a shower, but the Taga shower. There's a tone ya person, number piggy shower. There's a tone my babu don't publish shower. Then I talk about some cigar. There's a yellow tone and them yellow Shinda yellow saw while at Danny, Shinda said talk about Nashi. Shinda said tell a shower. Nashi, de Pumbunga Latane, talk about some la. That's a shower matter. Tell him all Tadeva. Oh, Tirret and rich and Tadi your Mareswara. Just to Namjung and some Lunala. Ah, so do Sobo Pasha, Sem Pasha, Toa Pasha, and that's you not a show. Then did your Mareswara. Nga something I shook some Buyana shadow, and then I said, Chagdanki at the Kanga Yungura. Tipa thought a man Jamaica to Dalia, no time to Dalia. Then I did this Omar Dasi. Shayora. Oh, tended. They say the young lot saw them last. Shinda need yours, Shindel Peshat Soda. Shinda don't thought you needed somebody does, Pumbunga and the part of Samla. Shago de Ese. There's a Chawache, but the target Chawache, Shago de Ese. Till a lost Chawache get Logashi Omar. Come back with Jam do it on Tardu to Seoda. Kadake shake to the target, shake to a shower matter. In my engagea, Shanga Logashi, Kayo Maris. What is you, Lana?
So then continuing with another quotation from the Entry to the Middle Way, it says, were it not so, if we compare the chariot to the self, the mere collection of a chariot's part would constitute a chariot. So here, when we think about it, the various parts that constitute the basis of designation of something, like the self, or here in this case, the chariot, like our self, the form is not the self, the mind is not the self, but it's rather something which is merely designated on that basis. So here it often uses the example of a chariot, but maybe we could modernize that and use something like a car or a plane. They have more sort of components we can think about. So when we go through all of the sorts of parts that make up that basis of designation, like a plane, all of the various components of that, we can't point to anything that is that plane, that is that thing. However, when we speak about, oh, well, the plane is flying, the plane is landing, we can do so coherently because upon that basis of designation, when that thing functions or does something, the thing so designated is able to function. But there's nothing apart from that basis of designation other than the mere designation. So when we think about, like, for example, with ourself, it seems sometimes like we talk about, oh, this is my body, oh, this is my mind, as if there was something apart and separate, that we're this I, that we're in possession of those various things. However, we can't find something that is separate from the body and mind that exists as such a self, but rather it's merely on the basis of dependently designating. Like, for example, there's a collection of parts that are assembled in a certain way, and we call that a plane or a computer or a car, whatever it may be. And there's nothing within that we can point to as being that thing. However, when the thing functions, when we have, like, for example, a plane, it's going up, it's coming down, we can talk about that as functioning because it is something that is merely designated on that basis. If we set aside, like, every component of a plane plane, and we look through each of it. Is this the plane? We can't find anything that we can say, oh, that is the plane. And so too, when we look at ourself of the person, like we can if we set aside our body, our mind, our feelings, and so forth, there's nothing separate from that that can act as the self. However, when we have this strong thought of I, it seems as though there is a self that is somehow separate and apart in control of those things. And so these teachings are really to help us to reduce that kind of sense of I. Once we have that kind of strong I, we give rise to the thought of mine, and then attachment and aversion and so forth. But if we come to realize that these are merely designated on that basis of designation, that helps to reduce the kind of force of that grasping at a self. Like again, when we look at our this I can say like, oh, I'm walking when my feet move, but it's not as though the I is those feet. There's nothing other separate apart from the various components within that basis of designation that is that self, that is the I. However, when our body and mind act and function, we can say, oh, I do this, and so forth.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's about doing a look as a charity. I did it. Oh, no. Actually, Rawajan get out, you know, say. Talk about Chibu Rawajan. Tadi, Sanje Chum den de Jagal Peroa. Jagal Pedu, Ting any, you get Ting to you gangi. And it took them out to do it down to the Shagora. Conjo Sena Karasiwas, that said, Kogena Loriora, Cheetah, the Nagita said, and Ramada Shagora. Nagita did Nalo Yor and Nagichebe Bushe. You talk about a sopo chilo yoda. And the same did Condonga Geshe to Lohara. That did Nalo Yor Escoda. You talk about enjoy your mother, sopon you and do it. That did you and do your mother. Talk about Juro Meba to let talk about so you don't take mother. You don't take you on Juro and do your mother. Talk about Tawase, Chipuse, Chipus to color wonder comare. And so suppose and me lose and go down Kangba, like what a mambuches at Tata and Cuba down Mambuchi legation, and you lose shower. Chasha Mambuku do Aqualia, Chanda Mambuku do it, so let then any lose cigar. Kamba is in a Chasha Mabu or Toda, Gigunda Saba, the Mabuyora. The Zulet then any Kamba shower. Chasha Mambuku doa. In the Koma, this was Adalia, Koran Chibu. Shanda Suchi Koma, Koran Chibuya, you to Chamis, Chache Yomar Kole. Chamis, Chipus, Chamis Chibusora. The Rawan say. Koran Rawan to Mare, Shandala Tus and Delneco, Shagwet and the Yomare. Rawan to Tuba, Rangune Tuba. Rangshinji Tuba. The Taji Ramajan years ago. The Sanje from dead depend on the Taji Ramajan get Dayo Maris of Gora. Tawachibu Rave Tanga, Singa, Tawachibu Shibuchi, Yuna, Yebe Tora, Yuban Zimbati, any guy is a shukchambo. Any guy could go to the Chagwa shukchambo. You'll never can get on the Tawa shukchambo. Any Chagna Teo and any lamb, Ramadasaya Kanga Yongo, they say. I didn't see Chiruban Devanashi Maris and Gora. O T Indico. Taji Ramachan Jeta, your Maris, Gora, Nambashana. The year now, Sigora. Nikiwanga my tata, Tande Tade, your Chimeta, some got children together. No, I talk about any conjuan do Marwa. Rangama, your Harish in their high Cobenate. Tatanga me Cobenate here. Mahobana Chicheko, that's George and Driver Chara. Those are watching enough. And it going as a part some J. Tanam Chidun Juratas, that's Chigura. Joy Machim Shatira de Dora. And the Dana Tade Tade. And then Tade Tade Kyoangamani, you are the Sora. Tade Tade Kyoachimala and do this. Tatira. The Dana Tade Tade Kyoangamar Yobatas. Tade Tade Kyoangamana Yose. Kyoachimaya Yoban Jole, Kyoachimaya Kote, Yoduba. Tedana Tada Lugina Ravado, Tandako me Lugina Ravachin in net or Resivara. Ravado Yebe of Geshe. It is Tadare. Oh, yeah. Tedana Tada Lugina Yebe Sigora. Tedana Tada Lugina Ravado, Tadako Ade. So Soguna Ravajin in net or Res, Koshandala Tushike, Deokamar, Kora Ramzuto Cheche. Ravado Yebe Ade Joachime Lugina Zushuki, Poor Jurose, and that's over dinner day or day. Ashisuna. You and Nalo, you get out the Joachime Pumpinalia, Zundronia, you can attach a conjugal do Mara. Joachime Tagina Zushuki, Poor and Jurose. What about the children not about to do the Shigamaka?
No. So here then coming to where we had left off last time. So it says, well then, if there were a self that is permanent, unitary, and independent, the selves of 3 lifetimes, former, present, and future, would be the same. So here we need to remember the context in which the Buddha arrived in India, wherein most of the various types of schools asserted that there was this kind of self. Their assertion of a self was one that was maybe either external to the I, as we think of it, or sort of within the person, as this kind of permanent, solitary, permanent, unitary, and independent self. And so permanent here has the sense of being unchanging, of not arising due to various causes and conditions. It's something that remains stably without any sort of change, not being affected by causes and conditions. And then unitary sort of negates the idea, like with most of these things, we see that they are composed of various parts, and then we designate a thing on that basis of all of those parts, on that collection. However, the self that is asserted by these kinds of Tirthikas or non-Buddhists is one that is partless. It doesn't have any various kind of parts or components to it, but is something that is unitary. As well, they assert some kind of a self that is independent, as in like autonomous or set up from its own side, inherently existent. And so when the Buddha came, he taught that there is no such self. He refuted the idea of such a self that is permanent, unitary, and independent, as well as others. But we have that kind of feeling, particularly when we have a strong feeling of I as being this thing that has this kind of independence, autonomy, and permanence, and so forth, then our sense of mine is much stronger. And so too is our attachment to ours and the things that we view as on our side, and the aversion toward that which is other. And so too, we create then more karmas because of that. So here, this sort of a self that is permanent, unitary, and independent is refuted. If it were the case that there were such a self like that, then the self of our previous life, like say you were born as you were a god in the past, the kind of I that's like maybe within that God self would have to be this very same I without any sort of change that's now in a human body. So here, to have such a self that remains independent, autonomously, without being dependent on anything else, we would have to assert that then this sort of self is exactly the same in the former, present, and future lives. So if this were so, the present life's self would exist both in the former and future life. In addition, the independently existing self within the present body would migrate by entering into the body of the future lifetime. So if we're making this kind of assertion, as these non-Buddhists do, there would have to be some way for this unchanging self to somehow sort of enter into the new body of a future lifetime and so forth.
Oh, yeah. Yeshi do Hane Miri Kiwi Sigura. You are not the high machine, and the million case on the Sigura. Yeshi do Hane Miri Kiwi say, and they had a me, Tani, Ramune Tuba, Yina. You are not me, Lata, Joachima Mil Kiwina. 하다 미니부터 라운드 주바이나 라와가 소소 주바이나 시고라 라운드 주바이나 라미니 라와베 소소와 이나 세네 하다 미니 라와베 교강함에 하다다 첸디 미니부터 라와베 소소하래 도래 고라니 지실에 뜻이 될 멤버 라와 라 이나 규칙과 미로네 간사니부터 교강함에 하다 첸디 미니부터 간사 규칙과를 말해 규칙과 봐. 아마든 주라 두고 셔는 마도 세용 되게 되요 말아. 군이 치대 라와에 소소하라 봐. 교황아마데 라와데 첸데다 그 드와케요 말아. 첸데다다 교황아메 달에 드와케요 말아. 나메 달에 때네 치메다데 끼고요라. 텐전된 마용으로 하지 드와메 코 라와하라 봐. 라와에 소소하이나 규칙과 롱고 말해서 가사 규칙과서 쇼라. 이 롱고 말해. 라와베 찍이나서 라와베 소소하이나 드와메 드미던 셔데도래. 얘네 규칙과 롱고 말해. 와, 규칙과. 라와베 찍이나서 거기 라와베 찍이나 아니 교황아메 하데래. 다 첸디 미니부터 찍으려도다. 라와베 찍이나 미니디 찍으려도래. 라와베 소소하이나 지질은 좋아요 말에 규타대버 규칙벌이요 말 규칙벌이요 말에 어떻게 연구를 해서 거야 어떻게실라면
So, accordingly, when someone is born as a human after a lifetime as a god, if the two selves of a god and human existed from their own sides, that person would have to be both a god and a human that were independent and distinct, like yellow and blue. So here, if it's like someone in a previous life was a god and then takes a rebirth as a human, if those two are considered to be like independently, inherently existent selves, then this would incur the fault that they could not be both part of the same continuum. So when you have something that is autonomously independent, as in a lifetime as a god and then the lifetime as a human, if those two are each sort of autonomous, set up by themselves, independent, then it's not possible to posit those as being part of a single continuum. There's no connection between them. They're absolutely distinct. And so if they were like this, they could not be both part of the same continuum. If they were the same and independent, you're trying to assert that they're both independent but somehow the same, then such a human would be both a human and a god. So there are these faults that would incur if you try to assert such an independent kind of a self as existing in the previous life and in the current life or the future life. If they are sort of independent in the sense of having their own distinct identities, they can't be connected within a single continuum. But if you then try to assert that they are both the same, we would have to say that the human could be both a human and the god at the same time.
Oh yeah. 자야 자실에 대공작도 내대 라데 메데나 그다나네 따버죠. 라에 에버셔네 라데 미티라네 주라이네 따버도 그래서라 라에 미아데니래 얘들 라미셔나 균데 때문에 하다 미니부터 라와에 셔이나 아니 규칙 바른 거 말아. kon 자와 매버셔 말아. kon이 라와에 지질 뜻은 되고 말아. 얘네 거 내가 소라 규칙 받이 되고 말해서 와라. 얘들 라미셔네 균데 때문에 주로 시에서 오야 그 롱티치로.
And so then the source for this, the text that supports it, is Nagarjuna's fundamental verses on the middle way, wherein he states, if a human were a god, in such a view, there would be permanence. So again, if they are somehow autonomous or and yet established as a single thing, then we would have to have a way to say that the human were a god. And that's not logical. And also, if the human were different from the god, as in autonomously, independently established as distinct, then a continuum would not be possible. You can't posit two totally separate and distinct things as being within a single continuum. So this is the source for this.
Oh yeah. 아 뒤집에 다 매봐 시도. Tui Drebas to Nazu, Nemeta de Tanda Yobatachi, Tandeta de Nema Yovan, Tui Dresora. Penanganzo Sosuracin, Gangema Tendresio, some Tanda Tendresio, some sa. Nemeta de Tandedi, but Tanded Nemanashi, but the Tendres Samtagdoa. Takbat, Tangzi de la Tundin Sigra. Kesa you, Tene, Sani Tegre Sambena. Kesa Yagi Tadi, Tene Yomaro on the Sana. Tene Tadi Sani Deg Maro, you take the Mado, Takura de Omaro. Kesa meet never ina. Tene Tene, Tene never the Deora. Kesa meet the Sabaki which there, Tene Samba Magiciane, Kesa Tadi, Tene Sabaki which Deagora. The Kesa Tadi, Tene Yomaro, Kiji Jundura. Without was at it, this was a casora. Tangzi de la Tudri Sigra. I met the Chimani for Chibush and Dredu Yora. Tudri. So that Tudri poeta meba. I met the Tanda Yubashet, Tanda de Nema Yubashet, Tina Takura, Pumbinal Papa to Tadi Chibashe, Tanda me Pumbina Shuya, Chimal Hades and Lai Pumbina Shu, in Dresden to Geshe Yokura. Poa Sigra. Tudri. O Dishayora. Tudri poeta mebas. Thabkhe Tata, Rawine Drube Tagi, Samju Chirikba, and Didagi Chimbese. Thabkhe Tayo se Rawan to Drube Tayo se Tende Samlu Yoba Tigi Siora. And it can't get Gashiki, Tade Rawe Tade, Kyongamane Yosigore. Tande Rawe Tade, Kyongamane Yor, Kotawade, Kenjoyo Mare. Tande Rawe Tade, Chimal Ban Roshagre. Chima Degre Tina Roshagre, Sopushandas and Roshagre. Rawe Tade Sigora. Tade Rawe Tade Kyongamane Yobar Sampatas. Tande Dengamane or Tagba Tade. Tation to Tade Tade Kyo Chimara. Poor Sambada. Tande Tade Kyo Chime Pumbu Shandational Pondo. Pumbu de Chendro Madata Korante Tagare, Tinal Papondo de Sigora. When it comes to Chima Poor Sambatase. Champion Batabuke, Tade Tade Chiwana, Quinche des. Tade Tade Shisoneta, Quinchendra, Tayomare, Kyochima Yomare. Takabayo, Sobudin Dedoa, Semne Mangisharwa, Lulitan Semke, with any Semne Magishara, Lud de Tesa, Delitan Semedua, Tayomare, Quinche des order. Kyochima Yomare Sigora. Champion Batabuse. Tade Tade, Chiwana, Quinche, Yawachima Mebar, Tawala Sobe, Tawang Batumason, Odi, Ta Seti, Netsu Yabuchimashi, Tadi Tui Trebanzi, Rawa Samlata, Tendel Tena, Tendetawa to the Yongo Desora, Logeta Netsuta, Tumba Maimbe, Tawa to Yongo Desora. Yeah.
So next we turn to the section on there is no self that blends different time periods. So here, because of this kind of view of permanence, also holding to a sort of autonomous or a self that is set up by itself or has this kind of objective existence, but particularly due to our grasping at things as permanent, we think like, oh, before I was like this, and that I is somehow sort of blended with the I that is right here, right now. Or like the self that I have right now, oh, it's the same self that I had yesterday. Although it is the case that the continuum is the same, we are not the same I as we were yesterday. If it were the case that the I were this kind of permanent thing, then if we were sick yesterday, we have to still be sick today. This is permanent and unchanging. Or if we were happy, we had a happy sort of mental state, then that would have to remain because the I doesn't have that kind of changeability. But we hold to things as being permanent as opposed to recognizing that the self is momentary, is changing moment to moment. And it is this view of permanence that causes us to kind of blend these periods of time, like thinking that the self of, earlier is the same self that is now. It's sort of blended together. And so here, there are many wrong views arise from imagining either a permanent self or a self established from its own side. So, for instance, some people assume that the present independent self existed in a previous life. So, if they think that there's this somehow singular sort of self that moves through various lives, then you would have to think that this same independent self that is here now has to have existed in a previous life. Or others think similarly that this present self will be reborn into a future life, will sort of transfer to a future life. If there's this permanent kind of independent self, then the same thing as before, it's going to transfer into a new life. Now, there are also others, some like the Charvakas, believe there is no future life and that the continuum ceases at the time of death. So here, for them, they say that mind arises from form, and with the ending of the kind of form that we have, the continuum is cut. You're done. You're over. There is no more self. And so it is due to this kind of a misunderstanding. We don't understand how the self actually exists. And so holding it to be permanent or somehow objectively existent, that we then hold to these wrong kind of ideas that somehow there is a self that is like permanent, moving through all of these lives somehow, but unchanging.
Oh yeah. Not talk about dance. Chirube talk about killing God. Rangshinji Truba, Chiruba, Namba, Matu, Rangshinji Truba killing God. Tanya do you bet Takango, Umabanda China, Tade, Rangshinji Truba, your matters, Umatenjo Antishina, Rangshinji Truba, your matters. Tanya, Tatogi, Tanya, Takshila Tene, Tatogi, Tanya Takbe Wangi over race order, Tanya do you bet Asiora. Kange want to share jazz, and the Sumbu Kange want to share jazz. Nga me tu je ta chimar me po song sha so da. Jo nga me ta de chen de phung bu la po. Chen de ta de ye be ta de jo chimar ton de phung bu la phon do ne. De na shu do do tin de me ba song sha so da. Me po ra song de sa. De khung jang ge ra sa lu jang ben do na la song sha so da. Sa lu jang ben do le. De la chi ru je ten je de bran jo na ba nga ta de. Chi ru je ten de na ge ten de sin ni she do. 나기 텐데스네 텐데 양라 중이 지권에 코아코다 콜로 강사 아 다데 저 컨데스 코르기와라 컨데스 코가 til에 나기 텐치 드버 조스라 치 텐치 드버 저는 치 스테이션 나셀라 소반 잠불린데 컨데스 차바데 컨데스 용거데 til에 텐네 네지 지데 차 주지 심제도 컨데스 차거데 티 차우스들라 치 텐치 드버 조스도 칼라 롱텐세 남과 동바치를 롱체 텔레테네 아니 롱디시 빠주치게 추차테네 텐데 아차베스라 남바체나 어디서라 솔루장베 돌레 치르게 텐진 데버죠 남방아르타데스 치르게 텐데 토졸야 텐젠데세 남방아에 따고레세 남방아 데데데 임바 따고레소데 나 남방아데 가레스나 에네 오케이 Oh, the shot. Nambangartate, Sierra, Caragarta, or the Sena, Nambangartate. Talk about my imbadas. Doing debe, talk about my race, children of Cadishina. Doing debe, talk about my race. Kitchi lingua, don't get charted, they were. Whereas the part that do Nimetira Resha, kissing the Resha, watching Chinati, Nime, Longa Metresha, some good one. Tende reyo maro kopen juan do de yora titen ko kanga juan do de yora takbar mai bata se chebar mai bata se ya chi de ju nyele drab chi na sabyo de ma tab sabyo de kyu che me ba che den debu nyu de yong atende ma de se sabyo de juro chi te dan del ne ene ko nyu de ke hore so re kyu che ne sabyo nyele de kyu che so Any shine nyende nyugudia toyo atende marese. Sabe de jurge juri tune ma je yongurwa chesa otisura. Cheba mai badas. Nyene de kyu chene ne shine nyende de kyo atende marese. Kon del de kyo ko yara. Po mai badas otire. Po sede. Sabe de nyugu ngol pa podo yo mare. Sabe todo campo chora, ti mata verwa. Ti ene nyugu ngo pondo yo mare. Ti pen jura chinche ti kyun chimach. Ko jura dugu mendaj re dugu mato. Ngama de ti nal pondo ara ti de mare. Kyo nga me ta de sendi pumbu nal shudwa. Sendi ta de kyo chimbe pumbu nal pa shudwa. O ti de mare se wara. Poa mai batase. Ku chongo le debu chembo ngamba ndubada. Ku chonjo je na debu chembo ki yo aresa. Inga razu gewada tikbe langdo sondu tende songdo. Chi ngabula pe pel chembo resa. Sabe chonjo je pa tamna pe chembo. Chembo pe tende chembo tende keugdo ase. Inashi tikbe chonjo je sam gewa chonjo je sam nangjo chi yo maresa. Tikbe chonjo je kane keje shetanche. 미실로와 계제세다지 또스 만드나 에 드레분나미 동에 첨부냐고야 대화 충주지나 봐 충주를 삼비오 말에 이 드레분 대화 첨부께요 그래서 기대니들레베 이 교충주를 개요 말에서 낭미땅지오 말에서 교충주를 때는 드레분 첨부 치료기 신나들 소바 펠셔와 텔레자 나게 존데데 펠셔와 예송비오라 모두 교충을 드레분 첨부만 봐도 받아 대단 자외 교도 좀 와서 대단 자외 교수는 내래 대게 사버지 봤답니다 대 용거를 마도 로다 때문에 용거 말와 구슈 동부치 구슈 있다고나 대부 대단 자와 구슈 시키게 마도 저게 신도 가서래 컴퓨터 센터들이 끼고 말와 내래데 가래 내래 때문에 카차부치게 스벤데 저기 주셔졌다고나 정말 그 카차부 시키게 마도 대단 자와 년래대다 주 잡으라고 시키게 돼서 와라 주던 자와 셰다스 어디 봐도 질랍나
So, whether the self is permanent, as non-Buddhists would assert, or inherently established, as we see some of the essentialist schools assert that there is an inherently established self, or if we're speaking about a conventionally existent self, as the Prasangikas would assert that the self is a mere designation through concept or through term on the basis of designation. So whether the self exists in any of those ways, it is said that the self of the former time does not transfer to a future time. So whether you assert any of those kinds of selves, we can't assert that there is some sort of self that somehow from the earlier time then transfers to the future. So quoting then from the Rice Seedling Sutra, it says, external dependent arisings are to be seen as fivefold. So there is, when it comes to dependent arising, there's the kind of external dependent arising, and then there's the internal dependent arising, like looking at the 12 links of dependent origination, beginning with ignorance and conditioning factors and so forth. How does a being come to take rebirth? Those are the internal dependent arising. And then we have external dependent arising, how the external world with all of the sort of environment and the beings within it come to be. There are various sorts of descriptions of how it is that our universe, or whatever we might want to call it, comes to be, from having empty space and then wind and water and so forth, the kind of causality that occurs there. So here, whether it is something that is external or a kind of internal type of dependent arising, we tend to hold things as being somehow like permanent. Again, that the thing of yesterday, like we see a particular object or a thing and we think that it is the exact same thing that it is today. We have this sense of there being a thing that remains somehow. We don't recognize how it is the case that things are all actually momentary. Phenomena are all momentary and not remaining the same. Even the very atoms that comprise whatever sort of material thing we might be looking at, or other types of phenomena, are not going to remain without any kind of change. So here, this then says, external dependent arisings are to be seen as fivefold. What five? So not eternalism, not being permanent in the sense of being unchanging, but nor is it the case that there's annihilation in the sense of, like, for example, when we plant a seed, it's not as though the sort of substantial cause, in this case, the seed, has a continuum that is cut off that then becomes a sprout, but rather there's a continuum that keeps going on. It isn't as though the continuum of the seed is cut to then become the sprout somehow, but rather there needs to be a connection between those in order for there to be the arising of that sprout. So there isn't annihilation in the sense that the cause doesn't become completely non-existent, isn't like cut off, nor is it the case that there is transmigration in the sense of transferring the kind of essence. It's not as though like when the seed becomes a sprout, it somehow transferred its essence to that. We can't have a kind of single continuum with distinct things like that, essentially distinct items. So here, when it comes to the kind of self that is in this life and the self of a future life, it's not as though that self is somehow like transferred, transmigrated into a future life. And then it says that a great result arises from a small cause. So here, this is particularly emphasized in the context of karma and looking at our virtuous and non-virtuous actions. When we think about those things that we're supposed to adopt and abandon, we might think like, oh, those are just small actions. That's not significant. However, we can see, like in the way that a small seed gives rise to a huge tree, the non-virtues that we do, even if it's something small, like just saying something a little bit wrong, that can create a huge effect. And so virtue and non-virtue, we shouldn't disregard things as like, oh, that's just a little thing. That's just a little virtuous activity. Causes lead to greater effects, and so we should recognize that. And then finally, the continuity of what is similar to that. So it is the case that when we have something, it needs to have a cause of a proper type. Like when we plant rice, a rice seed, we're only going to get rice, not lentils or some other kind of corn or something. If we plant an apple seed, it's going to make an apple tree. It's not going to lead to there being like a peach tree or whatever it might be. If we have something that is spicy and we plant those, hot pepper seed, we are going to get something that is of a similar type. It's not going to be something radically different.
Oh yeah. 난게 땡제 대버는 중아 천년간대 셰베 값수 양식도 치 땡들이 천년간대 나게 땡들이 천년간대 셰고라 나게 땡들 양라 중에 권에 과 코르단데 주셔야 돼. 가서 가사 끼와래다 셰고라. 이래 나게 땡들 셰도 나게 가서라 나게 땡제 대버는 중아 천년간대 셰베 값수 양 설루잠베 돌레 산제지 설루잠베 도 값수들이 송샤세 가르송도스네 땡이래스 지들 포함한 신나세 가사 교황함에 가사데 천들레 교황란데 남에 다디 풍분에 터네 네 풍불이야 슈운데 포함다 근데 말에 송거라 지들 포함한 신나 심전지 르멘다와나 교황냐베 교황마바라 주베 대체 포함한 심전지 르멘다와는 교황마들 하이마셔 교황치마데 밀케베이나 네 심전지 르멘다와 교황함에 하데 밀 풍불이야 슈바이나 에네들 하인 고로 단데 콜 하인 고라 교황마들 하레도라 콜 하이 미 풍분에 슈네 하레도라 라마르와 미레도라 교황마데 하데 미 교황람바테세 나마들 하레 시마데 미레 나마 하데 미 풍분에 슈도에나네 미 풍분에 여게들 하인 고레세 라마르와 코이케 메라데 소라 나마데 미레 하레 단다데 미레도라 지다 포함하시네 심전지 르멘다와나스 하다 미니 르다마르와 교황마데 미나 교아치마데 할케나 르멘다라 교황마 하제 치마 밀케나다 티 르멘다다 포아이나 르식바인 거다 교황마 미디 교아치메 풍부나 포아이나 미라인 고라 뭐지세 르멘다와나 교황냠바르 냠베 교와라 넘버 두베세 예시 포함하이너스 네 교와냠바 라데 남메 라데 메리 풍부나 포아이나 네 단다 미르 마르 하인 고레세 하다 교와냠바 하인 고레 미르 마르세 예시 포함하이노세 Sheda, te teje, Kamashile, Drabanal, the resources. Mendravana, Shechawane, Mila Sobe, Ritumba, Lala Soba, Ritumba, your poor Maris and Dakarisna, Joanama Miravasera, Joachima the Hadavasera. Kunya drama song asawada, Joanama the Miri, Shima the Hadava. Mendravana, Joangame middle hall perma mare, Sai Pumbina sugar mare, Jenny caught on the meaning gura. Lade Sadwa, Zako, Joakora Mendra, Joa Mendra de Sades. Shechawane, Mila Sobe, Ritumbane, Joangamako Miri today. Hala Sobe, Ritumbal Kibra, Tashine. Nangame made Joe Pumbinal sugar and Tandako Miri doing gura. Call Hada Ritumber Sadwa. Ritumber Kive, she so Tibatuchilla.
So then Kamala Shila's detailed commentary on the Rice Seedling Sutra states that as cause and effect are not the same, there is no transference. And this will be further explained in the context of explaining internal dependent arising having 5 characteristics. Then the Rice Seedling Sutra states, how is internal dependent arising not transmigration? So from different species of beings arises birth in a common species. Therefore, internal dependent arising is not transmigration. So here in a previous life, if you have a being who is, say, a god, then they enter in or they transfer to a different life as, say, a human. Therefore, there can't be sort of transmigration. If it were the case that someone with such a self were born as a god, and that self is then transferred to the next life, it would have to be the same. It can't be the case that, say, someone was born as a god previously, and now that sort of god self is just within that human. That doesn't make sense. When beings can transfer to different types of species or different types of being, then it's not possible to assert that there is a kind of transmigration in terms of internal dependent arising. Therefore, if that were the case, then all of these beings would become the same. So on this point, Kamala Shila's detailed commentary on the Rice Seedling Sutra states, different here means to be reborn from one class of beings, such as humans, into another class of beings, such as gods. So again, if we assert that beings can transfer into different types or can become different types, then they therefore cannot have this kind of a self that transmigrates, that is sort of being transferred to different lifetimes. That doesn't logically work.
Oh, yeah. Oh, then Pumbule Tensembe, Tabeta, my true bestseller. Pumbule Tensembe, Tabeta, maybe. Joanna Jipar, the Chima, the Kagare, Sarah. Then I send the Chabado Chebeta deta this, Tata deta this. Joachima Harris Chebina. Joachima Lai Pumbula Poa Meto, Sarah. And I couldn't join Mavich to take me to. Your members attended meetings like Pumbuna Jundun and me Gura. Oh, this order. For your mother's order. Yeah, Solujam Bendolese. The Kunta Sanjay Solujam Dirk of Sonshase. Tell a Churkayan Jiden Dine. Jiden party to Mepomegese. Churkayan Jiden Dine, send Dine, Seshimalva Pondraji or mother's order. Mepomege. Judan came my son, Meba Savishana, Legend Namijin Jebu, Joachima Yongudes order, Joachima Yodesa. The Kunshan and Mare, Joachima Yodesa. Poor Mare, send it out the Majursetina should do it in the Yomara. Could you bring you, Madame Shani, in the Zerendo Yonamato? Kayan Jiden didn't, Jiden Paruto, Mepomegese. Judan came my son, maybe, said Legend Drepung by a Yodose. Judan came my son, maybe, Jene Bandra, the Piggy, in them Jorsa the Chiana. Judan came son to the Cotinent Jurgen Jugan Piganala, Joachilan to your days. Joachima Yodese, Jolania Yodese. Send it out the Majurse Pina should write in the Yomara. Con Joachim to go to Joachima Piggy. 풍분히 좀 자사 텐데도 소되네 반도 이제는 그 레전 제부 하다 밀에 껴와도 요래서 껴치면 요래서 하라 그다게 마상와 매버서 레전 제부가 봐야 요도세 이 배터리 용도 왔다 디오나마 이보도 실람나 배워들 랍쇼다
No, no. So, consequently, a fixed self separate from the aggregates does not exist. So, it cannot be the same self across the past, present, and future lifetimes. So, again, it's not as though there's somehow this self that is like fixed and unchanging, yet transfers from this life to the next. There's nothing that transfers at all. But here, as it explains then in the Rice Seedling Sutra itself, so nonetheless, in the Rice Seedling Sutra, regarding that, while indeed no dharma at all passes from this world to the next, because causes and conditions are not deficient, the result of karma appears. So here, it's not as though there is some kind of unchanging fixed thing, dharma, that transfers from this life to the next. But when all of the causes and conditions are present, then there will be rebirth. There will be taking a subsequent life due to the fact that all of the various causes and conditions come along. So this idea of a self that's somehow fixed and unchanging is untenable, but rather this self, so-called self, is changing all of the time. The sort of basis of designation is changing as well. So when it explains that there is no dharma that passes at all from this world to the next, it's not as though when one takes rebirth, there's some sort of unchanging fixed thing that transfers over. However, when we have all of the kinds of causes and conditions, the various sort of karma and a place to take rebirth, then those conditions will lead to another rebirth without there being any sort of transference. So then it turns to kind of examples for this.
Oh yeah. 다 빼셔도 와. 근데 개체벌에 겨와 치마 랑당데 셔도 와. 겨와 치마 컨디션 포도요래. 겨와 치마 컨디션 용도래. 셔도 와. 이 빼셔요라. 포요 말때 레전 제부 겨와 치마도 요래 셔라. 이 여당 빼셔도 와. 베나서 랍도 치베 멜롱게 킹고 라서 멜롱 셰고래 쌍마치 요나 나노 요나네 셰고 말와. 야보지 치제 멜론 세브레 쇠세 당내마이네 라다 근데 디오라네 야보치네 코티네 셰그라 다등산데 셰고체 세브시부 요라 에코 랍도 치네 짱마스네 요라 근데 랍도 치베 멜론게 킹고라세 멜론 고고티나라세 요라 신기 송예 나와야 멜론 두스타그라 소소 동게 송예디 비그나 동그라 신수도 돈을 세워라 신레세도 신세 신기 송년도 비그나 차거라 송년 차와 대야 세워라 시고나 떠그라 가지고 받다도 근데도 다 돈도 쓰다그라 어때서 페나 rab도 집에 멜롱게 kengola 신기 송년 나와 양아서 동게 송년 비그나 레그라 네 라신 가서 신기 송년 나와야 신데 멜론날 포 말해서라 소소 돈데 멜론날 파 슈드라게 요 말아 소소 돈데 멜론날 슈제니 비네 수차요 말아 베나 니마데시나 니마샤스노 추다 강게 달한테 니마다 다외 포그라 대산데시 비네 깨져 셴는 잠불 강걸 깨져 거야도가 이거 비게 깨져 되는 슈드라게 요 말아 나저 디날 슈체게 요 말에 이네 카트라는 데 텐데스 소데네 티네 강게나 카트라는 것도 마도 코 디날로 디날로 나한테 배 라메베 쇼지단 도고도 소조치라 코 디날 슈체네 근데 코 그게 지 여바체 내 교진지 사나 코르데 렙게 와르시고라 마도 제 피게 디날로 주도나네 니만 다와도시다데 가스카다 주도 거치라. 근데 계제도 편에 쉐딩 가서 가스칼도 지금 지어사야 만분도 샤그라. 이나게 쇼고 말해서라. 그런 피게 내 교진지 사는데요나. 그런 땅 맞지는 때 강가샤 그러가 송년대 샤용으로 니만 나왔대. Tama mena todabene shaga barwa. Tama je soje shego charwa chi kyujin sande nitna chadang gudwa. Tine ke shugo bedwa. O tina shi resi wara. Soso kyawan des pan ronge chi wara. Pajo de rosa kyawalan sa chunge chi yona. Kutina lebdu wara. Juran jon juwa che ndwa koran tina shugbe sunro manjur che ndo eke yo mara. Kutan kenge juran pikana lebdu dese. Jine shindu de kyo chima pika lebdu yo dese wara. Ya. Oh, jine kase. Tita de pena rabdu chibe melongi kengo la se shingi songye nawaya shinde melon nando poa me po me jesu. Kutan ke masawa mebe che shindu ngoba yodu shingi songye pikana le do asa wara. Pensu niga ke kuta kende sansun lebki wara mato. Tita shundu go mara. Tina shi. Kewa chima dine yore se de. Dine ko ta chindu yora. Kewa chima pika rosa che yone. Gyujin sansun tina le kewa la do. Pata ma lada lodia kare de che gyuji ina chi pika kora kesara tende chi sosun tina lebdu yore se wara. Le dan le je wage ko tebu de yungu de se wara. Mebo me che this was. Rabdu chibe melon je kido me po me che se. Yudan ke ma sama bebe chi shindo ngo ba ye do se. De shindo jurgudwe. De shindo dine suya shipe ba mela. Dine chi shine pongbu na ya shundo ne po do tende yo ma re che da. Mela se. Shipe ba mela shendo ya ma je de pongbu na zu shu che ne. Pongbu shenji na lu shu do yo ma re che. Yudan ke ma sama mebe che dine ko ta ke kyun chima chiba yugin do te yo ra. Kewa chima pigen do sa ke kewa lang sa ke shirab chi ko tende so de na. Ko tena liang kyun chima di lep do de so da. Kewa shanda si lep do se. Yudan ke ma sama mebe che legin Drepung ba ya yo do se. Shiba ne. Tada na nange tenjin Drepung chunga kendan dewa tawa shi song so. So tipo tsuti lam na. Ya.
So here then to give the example, and this is important because this is describing how it is that we go to a future life. How do we actually take rebirth? What does this look like? So it says, thus, for example, though the reflection of a face appears in the orb of a clean mirror. So like back in the day, they probably had to use something that was a little bit less efficient than our current sort of clean, nice glass. So you might really have to like rub something to be able to see your reflection. But if you have that kind of clean orb of a mirror, then your face, the reflection of your face will appear in that mirror. So though the reflection of a face appears in the orb of a clean mirror, while indeed the face is not transferred to the mirror, because the causes and conditions are not deficient, a face appears. So when we have all of the kind of causes and conditions in place, I like a clean mirror and our face, and we put it in front of that, we will have a reflection of our face appear in that mirror. But it's not as though our face was somehow transferred to that mirror. Or like we have the sun and the moon, and the light of the sun and the moon goes in all sorts of various different places. It's not as though the moon is like transferred to each of those places, or the sun is transferred to all of those. If it were the case that were somehow transferred there, you would like run out of suns and moons. Or if your face were transferred to that mirror in the course of projecting in a reflection, we would sort of run out of your face. This would be a problematic kind of thing. But rather, it is the case that I'll just continue here in the quotation. Likewise, no one departs from this world and is born in another, but because the causes and conditions are not deficient, the result of karma appears. So here you somehow, when the sort of path is there, when you have all the kind of causes and conditions present, you are going to then take rebirth in a new life. And it is due to this kind of causal process. It is not as though there is some sort of transference of the self of the past life to the future life. However, when all of the kind of causes and conditions are assembled, then you will take rebirth, whether it is in a mother's womb or like but miraculously or whatever it might be. And so there is nothing, no one, no being, no self who goes to the future, but rather, as this is explained here, it is the case that there is a process when all of the kind of causes and conditions are present, it will lead to that. So now here in the English, we have this long quotation, but it's just sort of given in part in the Tibetan. And so we end with the last part of this. But in that way, the dependence on conditions of internal dependent arising is to be seen. And so there are lots more examples that are given in the English here.
Oh yeah. That's in the Jawachima some Chususidwa. Or the Mayan Jashidwa. Chidar Marmede, that the best Jana Shigdwa. Penangazu Chemi Pagdwa. Chemi Padus, Chemi Pasha, Chemi Tambu Pasha gave made a Niva Redu Regumara Casure. Young old Pogumara. Corante Tonre Bada Unit, or the Numda Red Tonre so manner. Could Tanya, you did our joint to say young Jagra. Mado Tagi met Tambupaya, anybody nal papa, anybody Sumbana put in the Gumara. Tanya Chasana num de Mazo Bato, no red on num de Mazo Bodo, joint to Tada Languda. Yama the dinner should do Eke Omara. Yama the Yeva de Kenji Chima de Yamdoka, the Chel Chick Levion Gudua. O dinner she says, you are Chima Levion girl, Matoji. Yama the dinner Pondra Eke Omar, the Pemamuchan Shegra, Umbuluduke. In the said that I give us some choose. Chidara, Marme Keji Mayimbe, Keji Nama de Chimmer Mepoyasa. Mame Keji Nama de Chimanal Papa can do Yamara. Mepoyasegora. Mepoya. Marme Keji, Kunsam Parma She to Shandu Drashindosa. Mame de Keji the Kum Chegma do a punch and Roshavera. Numdan Tore Maso Bato. Pajo de Kujin Sam and the Dray of Morocco. Pajo de Kujin San de Yon Numdante. So Rochivina Yanga Numchilu Chivina. Condoshavera, Taganas Batigua. And the ne Cote Yovache, that I never Pajo de Kujin the Sansona. Coconut dinner left to Resiguara. Yama the dinner should rescue of my Resiguara. Roa. Condesidosana. Chidar Marme Keji my imbese. Mami Keji Jigdora. Angama de Tambu Paradaga. Namsa de Chima de Liaco, Toreta, Num de Yonaco, take 20 Chima lived do. Odongama de dinner Keshu do Eke Omarwa. Gama de Chimar Mepoya answer. Tipa Persi dinner should do Eke Omare. Mami Keji Kunsam she Parma Shedo, Shanton Drosh. Keji de Kunchek Modopas and Gura. Pajo de Kujin de Sang, dead Mamma de Yu. Pajo de Lecon did Rosaki Kujin de Sang de Condo Shara. Again as a Nimashar, Nimashad, Nimage, Sunya Posa de Koran Tamachi Yona, Tamakaza Yoya Bada Podera, Tama de Mavasha Yanko, Navod of Chas and Sunya Mavachara. The Co Pajo take good and can't sans on the Corantina left to your Desigora. You watch my younger disorder. Keji Ngama Chimar, Mepoya, Mami, Keji Kunsam she Parma Sheban Droshinus. Parma Shekutata living good esora. And send the choosing the that choosing Tashi Serens, chooses Mingra, Nima Loseling Church and Pundab Drepung Johnson, and Mindele choosing Stagra. Sugar Chibatane, the Chen. Akasha Hala Sugar Penny, Ujorsona. Aging said at the Ming Tasiora, Jahalos, or Tisur, choosing some miming. Choosing the Tata, number ship and Manjur, Chimar Mepojas, choosing Tade, Manjur says, China should dry or mare, Namshe de Manjur China should drag or mare. Could I tune to the Pajo de Yonek, choosing Sayona, and the Pancha Yon de Resora. Chima Poa Meja, let on Yomon Bangoban do Chevale. Number Shebala so Pumbi, Kunsam Shinikwa Chim Kenya Maya Neto, Samjoala, Gavametos. Penadine, she do you better. Copy Kawachima, the round and draw you gave Pama of in some show all sober. The leg and draw you ever say. I couldn't never so to the Pignali, I could live do you order. Candy. Could live grass and draw you what I could and can't draw you. Oh, this is your. Oh, in years. Samjoala Gavameto also there. Some myself says she gave Jews and really give your mother. Namati Manjura says Tina similar shoe drag your mother soda or Tibet Silana.
So let me turn to how the self of this lifetime transitions into the next. And so again, using examples, and there are many examples to illustrate this, but for example, an oil lamp, because an oil lamp's flame is momentary, the previous moment's flame does not transfer into the next moment. A mere continuum of moments of the lamp's flame goes into the next moment without interruption. So here, it's not like when we have a flame that is burning with like an oil lamp, it's not as though the sort of essence, the nature of the flame in the first moment transfers to the essence of the flame in the second moment, but rather there is a continuum of that flame so long as the causes and conditions that lead to its arising are present. So until the oil runs out, you're going to have a continuum of moments of that flame burning without interruption. It seems as though it is continuous, but it's actually changing moment to moment. So here, there are lots of examples that are used. Nagarjuna gives lots of examples, and it's not as though there is some person, some self that is, again, the essence of them that is transferred to the next life, but rather it's part of a continuum. So likewise, although the consciousness of the self of Dharmadatta in this lifetime does not transfer to the next lifetime unchanged, due to the aggregation of afflictions and karma, a mere continuum of the aggregates of consciousness and the other four aggregates is conceived in the womb of the mother, the birthplace of the next lifetime. So here, when it comes to like the essence of a flame or a flame, the next moment comes right after that. As long as the sort of conditions persist, the causes and conditions persist, it will continue to burn. So too, when we have the proper sort of causes and conditions, like you clean something so that it can bear a reflection, then that reflection will appear. And so this is the same with our future lives. It's not as though there is some sort of like thing that is transferred, this self that moves to the next life, but rather it arrives through this continuum of moments of causes and conditions, causality that leads to that. So here we've got the name Dharmadatta. This is a name that was maybe given because they would make offerings to the Dharma in order to get this gift of a child. Datta meaning giving. So we often see Dharmadatta and other names similar to this, like Devadatta, when you made an offering to the gods and then you got a kid. Anyway, there is a continuum of this, the aggregation of the afflictions and karma are a mere continuum of the aggregates of consciousness and the other four aggregates that is conceived in the womb of the mother. So when you have all of the proper kind of karmic causes and conditions come together with the continuum of this, the aggregate of consciousness and the other four aggregates, then you take conception. When all of the kind of causes and conditions are right, including having the proper sort of causal karmic connection with those particular parents with whom you are going to take rebirth. It's not as though there is some sort of unchanging self that is then transferred into that next life. So here, there's no contradiction in this, talking about there being this kind of mere continuum of the aggregates and so forth.
Oh, yeah. Don't deal with the amount of some this. You are Chimalaya till you are pay. And I just sung to the amount of some this. The caressna. Lovenji Lomara Kadu Lobanas. Lama de children, the Baris Labine. Kandu Labine, it's a member. Yeah, and the share is Labgiuna. Share Dangi Chili, share Labgiuna. The Koti Labnet, the Nation Labguru Pajode. labdi paruchile na ko te labna shin takta labgirwa. Shere jen dangde takta ko tig tang na shin tang tugirwa. Ko pacho de tangye ge she de ko na pa shuye ke yo ma re chera. Ko te ya pacho de gyujin de changsunen paruche ko takta na shi chikba chikyang tang yung gire sigyo ra. Loba na kadun lomar poa me janse. Lama ga labsha kadun de ko na pa sanjele chapsu chawase sanjele chapsu chawase de dina pandre ge yo mara ko pige ko de lab pajo de ko labye ko no da kanga yone tin drabu chi lab yong gara ko lab de ne chikba chi jan shagra shere jina dang de ne shi chang paru chil ko de chikba chi jan le ngora o tin na shi re sora lame lab ge dang de pajo che da twa shu dre ge yo mara se gara Koran lende che so kudan ken sansun te de chikba chijan yongu to wase. O ti pe chigre. No ga ta se kadun sheba juwa ta se ro. Lo me lama dar kadun sheba juwa ta. She dang ge de chigware. She lam ge de lam ne tin na shi ko dang na shi phajo yongu de ne ko dang de pina pho dre ke yo mare. Tin na shu dre ke yo mare. Shi melon la po a me jas. Ta ta gin de ro. Melon alia Donde zita sona, donde melon alpa shu ni che ke yo mare. Donde yoba che pajo de melon de kyujin cha yo na, ko tina donda tita bumda kache na shang dwa, nima dawa tu sa kanga, le hu dwa. Ko tina shu ku mare. Ki shu ku nan ta nye sa tu nye le ta ring sa tu jima le ku rwa, drogo yo na. Inde ke yo mare kanga tuish di le hu rwa. Nga ranzo keche shewi watanda de ke she de. Ine keche shegero peke machine di yo na, kawa ina tina le yung kutuwa mada tina ke shu duwa ke yo mara. Yujin san tu di pacho de ka cha yung kora. Rogo ina ta ringa sa tu sul gor che le, kashe le, gyopa le veksan le kura, tinde me duwa. Pacho de yujin di san na, sungye di chiwa tenbun kacha yo na, ina sha yung kutuwa. O ti chikre si wara, tina shi, kiwa chima te ya. Yujin chance no koran pege le ngor ma do ta de tin alpa drone shu ni tin le che ke yo ma resh koran kyun ji le ngor de se la ane te jona ni ka se so nye jong ata de shen do ora ale tin ni chi lap shana
No.
penga yo
So,
ra ya
no. So there are many examples taught regarding this. We will begin with the first two of these. So when masters teach their disciples a daily prayer recitation by having them repeat the lines of prayer after them, the daily recitation is not transferred to the disciples, but the disciples know the recitation just as the masters do. So like if a teacher is teaching to a student without any kind of a book, like how to say a prayer or how to sing a song, they can teach them to sing a song with just the right melody, just as they have sung that song. But it's not the case that the song that the teacher sung somehow transferred to their students. But they are able to when the causes and conditions are right. Like the other party, the students have a desire to learn this thing and so forth. They have that kind of motivation. They have the proper faculties. Then they are able to learn that song. They're able to sing the melody just as they have learned it from a teacher. And it's not as though that song somehow like entered into the students. It transferred to them like that, or as if it were given to them, conferred to them in this way. But rather all of the causes and conditions create that the students are able to sing that melody just as they have been taught. Or the example, as we've heard before, although a face is not transferred into a mirror, a reflection arises. When we have the causes and conditions present, a clean mirror and our face, we can have a reflection of our face. We could even have like hundreds of mirrors and then hundreds of faces. And it's not as though our face transferred to all of those. Or like if we recorded our speech, we are speaking right now in a kind of recorded setting where that speech can then be heard all over at all different times. It's not as though the speech were transferred there. However, there is the kind of arising of that due to the particular causes and conditions.
oh ya oh meshele deshin do jale jaye burtan se do 이 테즈 될 소라 자스다. 테즈 마 잡샤는 버저데 집어치려도 모르자 돼. 잘래 자에 부르다서. 이 교진지 상고를 마도 되는데 판도에게요 말아. 콜리아데 나서를 가리네 뛰어고라. 버저데 쉬고데 까버지 벗어서 거라. 이 사선인데 잡샤는 가서 잡는 내용을 마도. 그 지난해 쉬우니 교진 사나 용기를 마도 마사나 봐 쉬우도에게요 말아. 아니 잘래 자에 부르다. 메실레 메다스. 메시데 메시나를 메게요 말아. 니마체 하네테 메시데샤 대슈우다 둘로지샤나 메바옹그라. 그 주진텐데 사선 내저도 도지요나네 바야게요 말아. 내저데 슈우까버지 둘로르지요나. 그 도샤시데 티나 메슈드에게요 말아. 메시나를 메게 슈요 말아. 네 주진텐데 소르데 코티 데 메바용도 와. 그 주진텐데 소스나 코나 베글레 거래. 저치마 베글레 옹그 마도 내 여가데 마주르제 파 슈제 돈데 세케요 말했어라. 근데도 잘라 자임부터 메실레 메다서도 주레 뭐가 시 통화다 줘발래. 쫄무 진도 쫄무들에는 티톤에 소서 마세나 가나 가주 동그라. 내 가셔야 돼 사네 좀더 가보지 사서는 소서나 가나 가주 동그도 와서래. 이 버저드 대 쇼예게요 말아 좀무디 쇼요 말아. 코나 주진텐데 소르도 언제나래 콜레 좀무체 가주 다용요라. 어찌나시 연구를 해서 자보다네. 뭐가시 통하다 줘봐다. 셴게 로녀와 통하래 셴게 좀무사 통소나 칼라 드럼주 통하다. 네 사벨레 뉴고다세. 사벨레 뉴고 줘야 돼 데려와. 사벨 도도 깜부스 파탑기어라. 코 줄긴 첼름 바셔르 지난해 아치 턴도기어라 마타치게. 코데 사벨데 야티나 슈드에게요 말아. 로망원 버샤니 아샤메도 샤카가 차용구라. 사벨레 뉴고다. 네 달레 트락사 좋아서. 어디에 아무도 달레 트락사. 트라스네 파슈 강바 동바 첨부터 나나. 게 잡는 때 강바 코로나 코레 잡시 때시 수트라용도 와. 별에네 리도스 리마무여라 리겔시 깨잡샤나 깨베 가스간에 코르제 드라요 그래 깨침보 셰파 드라는 간저 깨데파 드론에 수용에 깨요 말에 롱베 동바체 리파스에 깨져도 아 쇼셔보시잖아 수 빼침보 짜요 그래 이나시 강보 동바도 줄어요 그도 와 어때인데 파 라데파 슈네 진단 드에게 버저데 주진 텐데 사요나 그러나 지난 레병거를 송냐 차르나 신레병거를 써라. 지난 시간 좋게와 처만 줘야 될때 세디 셰바다 근데 괜히 와체. 저 처만들 라운드 드라이브 와케와 랑사르 주진 사요나. 그때는 랩도여라. 집에 괜히 마치. 그때는 주슈시 진데게 자고 말을 써라. 야. 내가 그래. 사벨은 요 텐데서 점주 당하다 사벨에 요구다 다샤레 트란종와서 대다테 포함해자 디날 슈드에게요 말에 디네 주디 여버체 퍼저비게 깬데 사대나 디날 레병 그래서 와라 대다주 앞에 기비 저 치만 중하라 송소서 저 치마데 어딘데션을 남기와래서 저한테 다다 셈도 좀 만주르세 파슈드에 된대요 말해서 센데 다다 셈게 괜히 대여버세 퍼저데 랑게지 괜히 내사게 파마라 소바텐데 녜지 얘네로와 이 규진데 다다 사요나 근데 내서 저한테 괜히 이거나 랩도 레다 넘버를 베드부 저와 상보다 냠바카가 퍼저데 랩도 그래서 요라 야 티버트 실람나
So here, continuing with these examples, then similarly, an impression arises from a seal, either a seal or a stamp, we could say, in that there's whatever sort of drawing picture on that is then transferred, or it isn't actually transferred to something else. It makes a stamp. It makes an impression of that on something else. It's not as though there is kind of the like we have to have all of the causes and conditions present, having like ink or having some kind of wax and this thing, all of that comes together and makes that impression. But it's not as though somehow that stamp, that seal were transferred to the other place where it is making its impression. And so too, fire arising from a magnifying glass. Again, it's not as though there is some sort of fire that is transferred. Like when we think about when we have a magnifying glass and the sun is out and we have something underneath that is flammable, like a plain sheet of paper, then fire can come to be. If we take that same magnifying glass and put it on a rock, it's not going to produce fire. All of the sort of causes and conditions have to be present, but it also isn't the case that that fire is somehow like transferred from the sunlight or from from that magnifying glass, but it is something that arises due to those causes and conditions. And so too, then your mouth secretes saliva when you see something sour or hear someone talk about something sour or see someone experiencing something sour. So if we, for example, see our friend eating something really sour and they're like sort of puckering their lips, we might ourselves salivate. It's not as though that sour were somehow transferred to our mouth or that we experienced in any of that taste ourselves. However, because the causes and conditions are right, we ourselves are going to salivate over that. So too, there's the example of a sprout arising from a seed. When we plant a seed, it's like this dry, hard little round thing that then becomes a sprout. It's not as though that seed is transferred into the sprout, the thing that has these nice like leafy greens and so forth, but rather there's a continuum that leads from the seed to the sprout. There's not this idea of something that was transferred. And then there is the example of an echo. Like when we make a sound in the right place, we can have an echo arise. In Tibet, there are lots of mountains, and so it's a good place for getting lots of echoes. If you say are to sort of yell into a valley, there's an even stronger noise that can come back at you. Or like if you're in an empty house, the right sort of cavernous environment, it's not as though that sound that you made is somehow transferred or comes back to you as it was when you made it, but rather because of those causes and conditions assembling, there is the echo of a sound. And so too, when it comes to our future lives, our life, it's not as though there is something that is like the self or the mind of this life that then transfers into the future life, but it is a case of all of the causes and conditions being present. So in all of these cases, something does not transfer to another place, but from the completion of the dependent arising of causes and conditions, they arise in that way. So this is the same sort of way that when we have all of the kind of causes and conditions present, we will have the arising of an echo or a reflection of a face, but there's not some kind of like transference. And so too, when it comes to the self of a previous life or the mind of a previous life and that of this life, it's not as though the self or the mind were somehow just transferred in, but rather there is a continuum of momentary moments that then leads to arrives at the point of a new life when all of the kind of causes and conditions are present that would lead to a renewed rebirth.
Oh yeah, ade chirashana. Ade tadaya gombo lutu je tente nyangbu le songdo. Gombo lutu je tente nyangbu na la songsha se tanda. Penga de songyora. Ene karasondo sone kadon labetiro. Ene marme chikle ni panche yongetiro. Melon liya shingi sunye ya tiro. Ene meshe le meyo ya tiro. Sabe le nyugu ya tiro. Kyurdan se kyurmu sawa tonga ta kyurmu tonga le tende kaju tonga tiro. Jese tata ne trakcha ya tiro. Longba Tongba, the Kamba Tongba Champutin, the Tata, the Sutra, Tata Angoda, Tata. O Petting up with the nation, Pumbo, Nizam Chowaya, Mepoya Kato Chasa, Pumbo China, and Mene Shine, Tadabachil Kiriona, the Meti, High Pumbina should drag your mother. Pajo de Tende Soyuna, Echo Hina Lendo, your Reswada. Podra, your mother, that's all Karasagosna. Chiruba to Zuge Sanjay Chum dead and my pay Kongi to Tama to Zuge. Takba Yoris, Takba Mana, Kichi and Jurki Yona, the Lega Chetu Maresagora, Chava Chetu Maresagora. And the countries Kawachima countries do this, Naman and Dine, Sendil and Dine Kawachimandro, Tarba Topse, Yurim Butan Rongi, Umaru Sigora. Takba Kores, Takba Manjuri, Naman De, and Dine Chimandro, Nikyo Mambukale. And Tarwa to Tamjo Kimbataware mother. Chenang Basu said, and she kitchen, George, and Tazulia, Nikyo Chimandra, Tarwa Tamjo Kimbakandas with a Sigora. Kichi in Jigna Chawache to Marasigora. Kichi in Jigna Chawache to what the Ganzu, the Sergeant of Lord of Tuzungu, some Tangatua. Law Pasha Yena, Nagunchina, Law Parena, Nagunalina, Tonto Marwa. Lord the producer. Lord the Kichi in Jigiora. Jigimana Pinnacle Droson Yumar, Lord Droson de Umara. Who heard the Tambu de part of the theatre Russian and Droson Bella Kesara. The Droson Yora. Lord Togazo, so Yina comes to Tene. You to the law Kangachito Gudwa. Green the Tuji de Yora, Chigichili, Levy Gora, Koran Kujingwag. You and this uncle this Chawachito Gudwa. Then I said, Talk by in a lega cheto maris or a Nambachena. There's some locagare. This is catching Jura Chagati Kanga Ronga Resigora. La Micha Jura, Milha Chajora, Tandusha Jura, Kanga Chajora. Damendra, Kujitended Sodus and Damendra, Aranza, Lola Measurement in the Chayora. Could I can't go on Jura Chavadilla Kanga on Jura Resigora. Joachimandra, you're the Tarwatoya, you're the Mikondo Sabu, the Conduction and Shaya, you're the Chambada Ninja Mava, the Champan Chayore, Shibeki Ganga Soya Yore, you are dry, you're the Kijima Sons and dry, Tagwa in a carriage, and Tangimana is there for the Sigora. Oh, teach you learn, do what you tell Sasha.
So so the Buddha taught the arising of a being's future life through these examples. And in the same vein, Nagarjuna's essence of dependent arising states. And so he lists the source of those examples then that we had before is this list. Recitation, like the recitation of prayers, oil lamp, a mirror or reflection in a mirror, a seal, a magnifying glass that makes fire, a seed that leads to, that is the source of a sprout, something sour, and a sound, again, referring to an echo, like when we have a really vast space, a big empty space or a big empty house and something, and we make an echo with our sound. So with these, the learned know that the conception of the aggregates also takes place without being transferred. So those examples are to illustrate how it is that we are able to take rebirth without having such a permanent self as is asserted by non-Buddhists. So non-Buddhists prior to the Buddha thought, well, if there isn't some sort of permanent enduring self, then how is there continuity? How can a being go from this life to a future life and so forth? How can there be the sort of progression to something like liberation and omniscience if there isn't this kind of enduring quality? If they say, as the Buddhists assert, phenomena are momentary, then for them that means that they would be lost. There needs to be something continuous throughout future lives to be able to, say, achieve liberation or achieve the state of omniscience. So one example that we can use from our modern day is like electricity. We can't see in the dark, so we need to have our light on. But it's not as though when we we flip on our light switch, it's just like one burst of electricity that then remains, was burst of light that then is like there. I mean, if that were the case, that would be great. We wouldn't have to pay our electric bills. We wouldn't have like a continuous flow of electricity coming. But it isn't the case that that light is just enduring. Rather, it's actually a continuum of disparate moments, moment to moment to moment. And that's why we have to pay for that thing, that it's continuing to arise. And so it seems as though there is this continuous light, but it's actually a series of moments. And so it is only because it is momentary that it can be functional. All phenomena that are permanent would not be functional according to the Buddhists. So one of their main assertions is that it is because all phenomena are momentary that they are suitable to be functional. And because it is the case that everything arises due to causes and conditions, and it isn't fixed and permanent, we can actually have the hope of change. We can believe that, say, we can reduce our anger. Like, I'm a really angry person now, but I could reduce that. If I develop these kinds of good qualities, they can get stronger and stronger. And that is all because of the fact that phenomena are momentary, and as opposed to being somehow fixed and enduring and permanent. So we will stop there then for today.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Rinpoche. Thank you for these beautiful teachings, and you've given us a lot to reflect on this week.
Oh yeah.
And thanks, Katrina, for your translation. We'll finish with some dedication prayers. May the spiritual teachers who lead me on the sacred path, and all spiritual friends who practice it, have long life. May I pacify completely all outer and inner hindrances. Grant such inspiration, I pray. May the lives of the venerable spiritual mentors be stable, and their virtuous actions spread in the 10 directions. May the light of Love Song's teachings dispelling the darkness of the beings in the 3 worlds always increase. Idam Guru Ratnam Bandalakam Niryatayami. Due to this merit, may we soon attain the awakened state of Guru Buddha, that we may be able to liberate all sentient beings from their suffering. May the precious Bodhi mind not yet born arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore. And for those watching online, we hope you'll join us again next Monday at 8 a.m. Pacific.
God.
Yeah, Tuchana again la, Tunja Jema Jeon.
Oh yeah. This touch.
Recording stop.